Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. The big bad wolf of the vaping industry is none other than Michael Bloomberg. Over the past 2 decades, he spent nearly $1 billion on tobacco control initiatives, which means hundreds of millions of dollars directed towards misinformation and outright lies about vaping. Bloomberg works with dozens of companies to help him poison public perception through advertising, marketing, and public relations. How could the U.S. vaping industry ever hope to fight back? Joining us today to talk about the fight to save vaping is Jim McCarthy, president of Counterpoint Strategies, the agency of record for American vapor manufacturers, the AVM. Jim, thanks for joining us today on RegWatch.
My pleasure.
So first off, what do you think of Michael Bloomberg and his billions?
Well, I'm struck most of all by the sheer narcissism and the hubris of his effort. My agency works with a lot of high net worth clientele. Many of them are leading philanthropists, and several of them are even on, sort of a par with Bloomberg in terms of their stature. But none of them are as, maniacal about trying to warp public policy and the behavior of fellow Americans into their own vision. And Bloomberg's sheer tenacity at that, I think, is really startling. And what's also alarming is that, normally a person like that, a billionaire who's working behind the scenes to strong-arm public policy in a way that many scientists and leading researchers, academics think is harming public health, impervious to criticism, it never gets seriously scrutinized. Normally, someone like that would be a huge, juicy target for the national news media. I mean, that's what the press is there to do. And yet he never endures the slightest criticism from any leading news outlets for any of this conduct. And, the scale of it is really staggering. The harm that's being done, I think, is horrendous. And so it's just that, I guess it's the way that hubris is combined with that he's gotten a pass from the national press. Those are the two features that jump out at me.
How much damage do you believe he's done, and companies he works with, like Vital Strategies?
Well, more than any other single entity in the public debate about tobacco harm reduction, I'd say. It's tough to quantify in terms of lives, but look, 500,000 people in this country alone die from smoking-related disease. That's according to the government itself. And, Bloomberg has, over the last number of years, poured more money, organized more networks, had a hand on more components of the effort to stop tobacco harm reduction than anybody else. So massive. And I think I think history will show it will be an enormous stain on his public legacy, and deservedly so.
He sure brings a lot of firepower directed towards vaping. What can you tell us about Counterpoint Strategies, which is your shop?
We've been working with American vapor manufacturers now for a number of years, and it's one of our smaller clients, but no other client are we more passionate about. And what we're trying to do is help a small, nascent, innovative industry that is doing real good in terms of public health and tobacco harm reduction to, fight its way through and up against a, really massive juggernaut. The odds are long. We're up against, King Kong and Godzilla combined, and but it's, we're passionate about it. And so, we're taking on the full weight of the federal government, one of the richest Americans in U.S. history, alphabet soup group of front groups. And so our heart's in the fight.
Now, you're based in the swamp in Washington, D.C. and up in New York, too, as well.
That's right. Yeah, I'm a swamp native. I'm a rare Washington, D.C. native. and I started my agency, Counterpoint, there about 25 years ago. And we have offices in New York and D.C., about 12 professionals. And mostly we represent large cap public companies, several of the very leading private equity firms. We represent a range of industrial trade associations in industries ranging from seafood to soft plastics, consumer finance, forest and paper. And we also represent individual business leaders, and we do some work in professional sports too.
How familiar are you in helping clients and companies in times of crisis?
Well, it's funny, very often, typically our clients will come to us when they're facing some, category 5 controversy or situation. And then we help them navigate through that. And then we very often keep those clients long term to help them, put some practices and rapid response and other measures in place so that they are able to anticipate and confront those those challenges, that hostility in the future. So crisis management is a very big part of what we do, but we're also about helping clients in the long term on managing their issues and taking part in a principled way in the public conversation about their company and their practices.
What do you make of the vaping file? It just seems to be like one endless and always repeating set of crises.
Yeah, it's interesting. The dynamics in the fight are very similar to ones that we see in other industries, where you have regulators, press, activists, and litigants all collaborating and joining forces to drive hostility toward a client. And you see that in almost every other sector: energy, forest and paper, retail, food and beverage. I mean, it's a very common dynamic, and it's especially that, the collaboration between issue activists and press, the way they act in, symbiosis, is a routine feature that's been going on for, several decades now in the way the press covers industry. But what's different here is, unlike those other sectors, vaping is new, it's small, it's a nascent industry. They don't have deep resources. They haven't got deep roots. They don't really have a presence on K Street. I mean, they're tiny compared to these other giant industries. And so, those other sectors are able to, hold their own and stand tall a lot more effectively. And they've got friends in all these various spheres of influence, but the vaping community really doesn't. And that, again, it means the odds are long, but, they're also doing, a world of good. I mean, I love, all my other clients. I think they do wonderful things in the world too, but vaping is really unique because they're helping to solve, with pure innovation, the number one cause of preventable death in this country. There ought to be a ticker tape parade. And so it's a real badge of honor for us to try to help them fight, even though they're up against, enormous odds.
Jim, share for us a bit of your story. How did you become involved in the vaping fight?
Yeah, it's unusual. We often get clients by referral or word of mouth or, our relationships. But in this case, I had simply been weighing in on vaping policy on social media because I used to smoke cigarettes for a couple decades. I smoked Marlboro cigarettes and tried quitting in a variety of different ways and never could. And about 12 years ago, I became what vape community calls an accidental quitter. And I was experimenting with vaping and tried using it. And after about 2 weeks, found that I preferred it to cigarettes. And I never looked back. It was like falling off a log. It was so straightforward and really, I think, probably saved my life. And like a lot of testimonials from a lot of other vapors, that my health improved and my stamina and on and on. There's a whole range of benefits. And so I began weighing in on vape policy just on social media as part of my routine, regular news diet each day. Although bringing to that conversation a lot of the tools and ideas and arguments that we use in our professional work for industrial clients. And that included, media criticism and confronting regulators and, zeroing in on specific pieces of data or info. And the head of American Vapor Manufacturers at the time, a terrific leader in our space named Amanda Wheeler, noticed that I was doing this and reached out to me and said, "This is, really terrific. You're having big impact here, and the points you're making are really spot on. Who are you working for? Like, what do who's your horse in the race here?" And I told her I don't have one. I'm doing this out of just my pure passion and interest. And then that sparked a conversation with Amanda, and I gave her some ideas that I thought would enhance the work they were doing, and by osmosis, a client relationship was born.
Now, considering the fact that your business is pushing back on the media sometimes, that kind of thing, trying to work those issues, when you first started posting on social media about vaping, just as a civilian, did you get some pushback from some of the people in the press?
Yes. I mean, reporters always get rankled when you challenge their work. In our little agency, we call that putting the cat in the bathtub. I mean, they're always going to arch their back and screech, and they think that they're, above all criticism and engagement. But the key is, I think, challenging them on clinical journalism terms in, a straightforward, substantiated way. Reporters are well accustomed to being yelled at, and you look at the comment thread beneath any article and you'll see, unhinged lunatic rants. So that's why it's crucial to do it in a specific way that points to something substantive, that brings facts to the argument, and that puts the reporter's own credibility at stake. You have to point something out in their reportage that is flawed, and why and how, and with a real hard basis to it. And when you do that, I think it shows the reader and the stakeholders who are following that journalist or that coverage that you've got something, serious to say. And the reporter faces a choice: either engage with that and live up to their principles as journalists, or disregard it and, suffer a knock on their credibility.
Jim, AVM is a great organization. You mentioned Amanda Wheeler. And then there's Greg Connolly and Alison Buchner. All have been on RegWatch. They're diehard fighters for tobacco harm reduction, aren't they?
Yeah, they're terrific. I mean, I think, AVM's got a really great, strong lineup that punches way, way, way above its weight. And so too, our customers and our members, and the broader vape community is really united in this fight. And that's unusual. I mean, as I said, we work in a lot of different industrial spaces, and it is rare to see the Industrial Trade Association have so many good, helpful, collaborative allies among consumers, grassroots, customers. And that's, I think, one of the real secret force multipliers that vape advocacy has, is that the vape community is so strongly aligned behind it. And yes, the leadership at AVM has been doing, banner tireless work. I really admire all they've done and built.
What does it mean practically to be the agency of record for an organization like AVM?
Well, a number of things. First, we carefully monitor what's being said about the issue in the public conversation, mostly in the news media, but also in the legal in the legal arena, regulatory space, Capitol Hill, other specialized silos, academia, and then we help the client assess how that conversation's unfolding, where we should pick our fights, and what we should challenge and engage in. And then when we do take on a particular, occurrence or piece of content or situation, we'll help fashion what's going to be said and do the first draft and help frame it. Often we act as a spokesperson for AVM when we need to speak directly with journalists or in response to queries. And then, of course, we run AVM's social media. So we really have a pretty wide-ranging remit. And that's great, too. I mean, another real wonderful aspect of working with AVM is that they give us a lot of latitude to to build those elements out and execute them. And it's not often, that clients, we have that much range with clients, but because of the situation and AVM size and the existential fight, we've all got to be, good, strong cavalry fighters that saddle up and ride out. And it's a real credit to AVM leadership that we have the latitude to do all that.
Describe, if you could, an example of strategies and tactics that are being deployed by the enemy.
Notice, in particular, we did a great thread, which I'll send you. You can link in your description about the network that Bloomberg has built, how the groups that he funds, and the overall anti-vape network that has been constructed. And if you notice, he has co-opted existing entities to push his mission. So American Lung, American Heart, American Cancer, Vital Strategies, Johns Hopkins, all of these were pre-existing entities that had Bloomberg's anti-vape, anti-THR agenda imposed on them, injected into them. He then brings to it, the public relations agencies he works with. He has in-house experts that parachute into these various entities to teach them, train them, help them target. And that's a very effective way to go. I mean, it requires a lot of money. I wish I had, $500 million to spend on vape advocacy. We could probably do a lot of good things too. But he has captured so many of these large entities. He's even bankrolling news organizations themselves. He's the ones that we've discovered. We have a whole nother thread on this, the research we did on his 990s of the news outlets. He's paying outright payola to cover the issue the way he prefers. And so, that's a real, I'm not even talking about like the lobbying that he conducts, or the other ways that he pressures policymakers behind the scenes. So that's a real insidious, powerful juggernaut that we're up against.
Describe for us how big of a role the news media actually plays in the war on vaping. And one of the things I'd like to get at is that, are the news media just poisoned by the PR and just kind of rolling along with it? Or are they involved as actors and they're malevolent?
Well, let me take that in two parts. I think, on the first one, the impact that they have is about not only public perception, but also about validating and pushing regulatory policy, public policy. And to do that, they are, stressing, that's why they stress the rates of youth use, and they, distort those figures. They push all kinds of, tenuous, health harms no matter how flimsy the basis. It's all focused on scare stories, alarmism. It's all very warped, but the purpose of that is not simply to scare, suburban parents, but to justify congressional measures, FDA regulatory policy, expand the regulatory state, to give a kind of encouragement and implicit permission for the regulators to put that policy into effect. It sanitizes it, and it gives it a momentum. And then, the second part is as far as what's motivating it. I mean, I think there's a kind of a mix of motivations. I mean, in some cases, there's outright payola. But in other cases, I think the press is, largely aligned ideologically with where Bloomberg is coming from. They take this same kind of, nanny state outlook on all sorts of other consumer products, from, soda pop to laundry detergent to plastics to automobiles. I mean, there isn't a sector that isn't touched by that, kind of pro-regulatory, pro-big government disposition. And I think finally, there's maybe worst of all, most shameful of all, there's a kind of sycophantic relationship with the regulators, especially in the leading major national press. They depend on FDA and CDC and other regulators for access. info, scoops. So not only are they sympathetic and aligned with their, ideological objectives, they also have a practical reason to try to jockey for the favor of those regulators. Now, all of that is in contravention of what they promised the public, which is objectivity, neutrality, fairness, balance. I mean, all those values that they love to proclaim, pat themselves on the back for, are just straight out the window. And it's a combination of all those factors that leads to what I think is, horribly irresponsible coverage. I mean, really, journalism malpractice. And that's echoed, that's not just AVM saying that, or, New York PR flack Jim McCarthy saying that. That's the studied opinion of dozens of the leading scientists and academics that specialize in nicotine science and, tobacco control research. So it's a disturbing phenomenon, and one that I think has got to be taken head on.
Jim, one of the tactics AVM uses on Twitter X, I just simply love. You take on the media and their funders head on, and there's these Twitter threads that keep coming from Greg or Allison or so forth. This particular one here that I'm showing right now, this is a Twitter thread that exposes the media and the millions of dollars they receive to peddle anti-vaping misinformation. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I think one of the fundamental elements we bring to the AVM communications is research. And in this case, we researched the 990s, the IRS tax forms of all the major foundations and bankrollers that Bloomberg has brought together. That will include Bloomberg Philanthropies, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we mapped out where they're giving all their money. And we began to discover that in many cases, they were giving straight up cash to leading news organizations like the ones you're showing here: CNN, National Public Radio, Stat News, and it's Associated Press. And it's deeply disturbing. I mean, NPR has gotten more than $25 million from Robert Wood Johnson. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is one of the most hardline anti-vape advocacy groups in the world. And not only are they ideologically opposed, they have a dog in the policy fight. They're also heavily invested as a foundation in companies that make nicotine replacement therapies, like Nicorette, for example. So they have a commercial interest in eliminating nicotine vaping, which is one of the main competitors to those products. So it's doubly corrupt. And so we gathered all that information and we put it in a easy to read narrative sequence on social media, and laid it out for the stakeholders to see. And we also placed that directly in the social media feeds of the various news organizations and their masthead editors, all of whom we confronted directly about this as well. And again, like they owe the public an explanation. They promise objectivity and independence. Here they're taking straight up bribes, and they can either explain themselves and justify it or not. But it's up to the public, the readers, and the stakeholders and the customers to judge for themselves. Is this coverage legitimate? Is it honest? Is it living up to its own promises? And I think very clearly in those instances, it's horrendously unethical.
And it seems that they're not even, providing even a pretense that it was for an ad buy or sponsored content or anything like that. It's just straight up payola money.
Well, that's right. I mean, you might remember back in, the 1950s and 60s, there was actually a major federal investigation that involved, federal law enforcement and congressional hearings and criminal felony charges about the practice of what was then called payola. And that was when record companies were paying bribes to DJs to put certain, records on the airwaves in order to boost sales for those songs. People went to jail. I mean, that was it was a major front page scandal. That's exactly what's happening in this situation. In some ways, maybe even worse. I mean, what's the harm if someone hears, pop hit X versus pop hit Y? It's ephemeral. In this case, It's deterring people from quitting cigarettes. It's preventing the most effective smoking cessation method ever devised from getting to the market so that people can switch from cigarettes. I mean, it's on a quantum level more harmful. And I think it's just a complete disgrace that those news outlets are doing it and don't even have the basic bedrock integrity to explain it.
So the Marcus of Queensberry rules don't seem to apply to vaping.
Well, certainly not on the other side. I mean, I think, from where the press sits and the groups that are, acting in symbiosis with them. And it's important to understand that, the various PR firms and front groups that Bloomberg is funding. It's important to understand they work in collaboration with the press to drive these narratives and push bunk studies and accentuate harm and so forth. It's a mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship. The harm that's occurring from that is it's just off the chart. It really staggers the conscience. But it's important to shine a light on that. I mean, I think that's, to touch on something you said earlier, that's part of the force multiplier for AVM. By highlighting this kind of thing, we've been able to put, AVM, I think, on an even footing in the public perception with how New York Times or AP or CNN or NPR are covering this issue. I think, I'd like to think you certainly see it reflected in our social media commentary and the feedback we get from Vape World. I'd like to think that we are one of the leading voices in the way that vape policy is unfolding.
You mentioned the Associated Press. Now they're on this list of organizations receiving this payola money, like millions and millions of dollars. And they feed into all of the local and regional press. I mean, they are the wire.
Yeah, it's disturbing. And it's not just that they're taking the money. I mean, that's bad enough. The real acid test, I think, is in what coverage results from that. Each one of those outlets, the grants they get have these sort of sanitized descriptions, $10 million to, focus on issues of public health arising from tobacco abuse. It sounds very, generic. And the news outlets themselves, of course, say, oh, well, that doesn't affect our editorial choices. They're just supporting journalism, don't you know? So the real test, the clinical acid test, is the coverage itself. And we've chronicled that. In the case of each of these news outlets, AP, for example, we've done, I don't know, at least half a dozen deep dive analyses of specific articles of theirs that show how they are routinely slanted, exclude all THR voices, zero skepticism applied to FDA, erroneous statistics, distortions. We point to those, those particulars, and we challenge the news outlet too. We've written letters to the masthead specifying all of this. We stand behind what we say, and we bring, hard substance to that conversation. And that's what you see. The money is buying those outcomes. There's a great quote we have in one of those threads from one of the deans of the media ethics world at the Poynter Institute. And he says, the donors don't need to give, specific marching orders on what to print. It's the same way that a pope or one of the Medici lords would commission an opera. You get the money, you commission the opera, and it's going to come out a certain way that's going to be pleasing to your ear. So, Stat News and AP and NPR, they don't need, paint by numbers sheets from Bloomberg. They know full well the kind of stories that are going to please him.
Are there any bounds, any smear they won't sling?
It's crazy. We did another great thread a while back where we gathered all of the sort of the most lurid, egregious health harms that had been, correlated with vaping. This is another one of the cheapest, most low down tricks that's used in academia, where they try to, correlate some ghastly health harm with a particular product. You could argue, I don't know, my favorite one is popsicles are correlated with sunburn. When you see popsicle use go up, sunburn in children also goes up at the same time. So it's that kind of thing. So we gathered all the worst examples, and it's almost ludicrous. Everything from hair loss, dental problems, erectile dysfunction. I mean, no human malady is too tendentious, too implausible, not to find its way into journalism content. And so, yeah, they have no bounds. There's it's a knife fight in a phone booth.
Well, and these are the same national news media health reporters that were also first to jump on the COVID train.
Well,
Public health.
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you point that out because the national press, I think, and the health agencies themselves, CDC and FDA, first among them, now fully realize, I think, that the many distortions, prevarications, and dishonesty in the way that those news outlets covered those agencies and what those agencies themselves said to the public during COVID caused an enormous corrosion in institutional trust that the public, ought to have for those agencies and for the press too. And they seem to have learned precisely zero from that lesson. The falsehoods that they've been pushing about vaping, and you see it in the data. I think the numbers are now like 80% of the public wrongly and falsely believes that vaping is somehow as dangerous or more dangerous than smoking. And that misinformation has to be laid directly at the doorstep of the national news media.
Now, what happens then to all of the small businesses and employees in the U.S. vaping industry when this misinformation takes over?
Well, there's been a huge economic impact. And I think it's a combination of regulatory pressure at the federal and state level. And then, also the misinformation, I think, deters people from endeavoring to switch to vaping. Those kind of forces have acted in tandem, and have had a just horribly destructive effect on, vape entrepreneurs, small businesses, vape shops. And I think that's most harmful, most tragically seen in low-income communities. The example I think of a lot is the vape shop in East Harlem here in New York, where I live, that was serving a low-income clientele, minority customers. It's in the most diverse neighborhood in the entire country. And it's a woman-owned business, and she was helping, poor folks in that community to quit smoking. That community is so disproportionately affected by smoking-related disease and death. She was, really doing God's own work. And state and federal regulations bankrupted her business. She had to close up shop. And she's done several interviews where she speaks firsthand about watching her customers go back to smoking menthol cigarettes and Marlboros to their immense health detriment. It's an unfolding tragedy that just puts the lie to everything the press claims about, caring about equity and disenfranchised communities, and, the FDA's self-flattering posturing about, helping poor folks. It's just, you look at examples like that and it makes you, just infuriated.
Jim, talk a bit about policy in the US FDA and how they're handling the vaping file.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously it's been a catastrophe, and you can compare it with their counterparts in the United Kingdom, where the UK national health authorities are, giving out vape products for free to people. You can buy them in the hospital, for crying out loud, and they have a tobacco harm reduction centered, public posture in the government there in the UK. So contrasted with that, as an example of just how wrong they've gotten it. But there's a lot of things to talk about here, but in the macro sense, I think what's important to understand is they are ideologically committed to that view. The leadership at that agency, Dr. Robert Califf, who heads FDA, and Brian King, who heads the Center for Tobacco Products within FDA, are both hardline anti-tobacco harm reduction zealots. They've been that way their entire career. If it were left up to them, as they've said on the public record, they would outlaw vaping across the board. Everything they do in their public communications, underscores that posture. So they're ideologically committed, but they're also subject to another huge force here, which I think I wish that news outlets like the Wall Street Journal and others would cover, which is called public choice theory. All of the incentives that FDA has are geared toward squashing all rivals to combustible smoking in the marketplace. The Center for Tobacco Products, which Brian King heads, their entire budget, more than $1 billion, is funded by user fees on combustible tobacco products. That is to say, they get a cut of the tobacco sales. So, that's a huge, glaring incentive to try to, drive away any competition to that product. And of course, they're being marauded or leveraged by members of Congress on Capitol Hill, who are all being lavishly funded in their campaigns and their election war chest by, yes, Bloomberg Philanthropies and all the others in that funding network. So FDA already wants to do it. They're ideologically committed. They've got macro incentives, which, inhibit them from eradicating smoking, and they're getting pressure from Capitol Hill. So I think those three malign forces are what's driving it. And then, of course, as we said before, they get no scrutiny from the press. There's never any pushback, attention, examination on any of these factors that you'll read in the Washington Post or the AP or New York Times or anywhere. So they have a free ride to do as they please in pushing these kinds of policies.
So FDA has only approved 23 products, so granted marketing approval. They're all tobacco flavored, pretty much big tobacco brands. Is FDA strangling the U.S. vaping industry slowly or quickly?
Yes, they are. And I think, they are. And I think that, if they had, again, if Robert Califf had his way, we've got a thread just a couple of weeks ago that, again, I'll give you the link for, in which he says explicitly, like, if it were up to me, I would wipe out vaping completely. And funny, I think he says in the quote that the only thing stopping me from doing it is that Americans enjoy individual freedom too much. So he's like lamenting he says Americans have a culture of freedom, he called it. So that's the only thing stopping him from doing it. But yeah, they are. And it's horrendous. I really think, history will look back on this as a mania of the first order. This is the same way we look back on alcohol prohibition in the 20th century as one of the most misguided, ludicrous, self-defeating, harmful policies of all time. And that we look back at the members of Congress and the others that led that movement, even the leading philanthropists. I think it was either Rockefeller or Ford, but the Bloombergs of the day were putting money into it. They're looked back on now by historians and anybody who's sensible about public policy as just, out of their minds. And I think that's what's going to happen here too. I think we'll look back on this in coming years and just think this was irresponsible, in the extreme. These people deserve to be historical object lessons of how not to implement public policy.
So when it comes to safer nicotine products in the U.S., we've seen actually, Zyn really make a dent and also ruffle some feathers. What's going on in terms of bringing the nicotine products together into some kind of coordinated fight?
Yeah, well, a lot of our research in recent months has shown that all of these forces we've been talking about, the Bloomberg Network, is now beginning to turn their, artillery toward other kinds of alternative low-risk nicotine products, like heat not burn and pouches and snus. I mean, it's better understood, I think, as a war on nicotine, rather than just as a limited war on vaping. And so they're putting more of their efforts into fighting and trying to eradicate those products. And we have a lot of sympathy for those manufacturers. Many of the manufacturers of those products are also members of AVM, and they make vaping products too. And of course, those products are also a terrific way for people to quit smoking combustible tobacco. And so AVM is going to be launching in coming weeks a new project, which is called the Right to Switch Coalition. And it's going to include manufacturers of the full range of low risk products, snus, pouches, heat not burn, as well as vaping. And we're going to begin bringing some of the tools and methods and good empirical research and content creation that we've been doing for AVM all this time into that campaign.
So is there any way then that the wider vaping community can help out with this Right to Switch coalition?
Yes, well, it's going to, just like all the work we've done with AVM, I think a lot of our communications are going to rely on that kind of grassroots engagement and customers, taking part in the public conversation and, rallying stakeholders to that fight. And that happens in a number of different ways, as basic as joining in on our social media, spotlighting things that need to be called out. I've been thrilled to see how many of our vape community folks have been applying community notes on Twitter to the leading lights of anti-vape advocacy. I mean, we've been really hammering them with that. And that's a result of, strength of the grassroots. But it also happens in like the bus tour we did last year to support congressional candidates who were pro-vaping and pro-tobacco harm reduction. And we were able to turn out, huge gatherings at those whistle stops for those candidates. And it made a big difference. I mean, several of those candidates credit their seat in Congress now with those independent, ecumenical, wide-ranging voters, putting them over the top. You talk to Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin. He'll say that he owes his seat to vaping voters. So with Right to Switch, we're going to be, trying to rally those same voices to take part in that broader spectrum.
It's an election year, so no doubt. Final question for you, Jim. Is this thing winnable?
It is. Yeah, it is. I mean, the odds are long and the night is dark, and we're in Valley Forge. That's for sure. A lot of our fighters have no shoes, and we're all hungry. That's for sure. But I think the sun could rise, and I think there's evidence of that. On the media front, you look at the major national columnists that we've been able to enlist to write pro-vaping serious stories, and it runs the ideological gamut. It includes bold-faced names, leading thinkers that far outweigh the gravitas of the day-to-day FDA beat writers. You look at the scientists who've now weighed in. The prevailing view among specialized scientists and academics who study this issue and tobacco science and harm reduction for their careers, all acknowledge the core tenets that vaping is vastly safer, has the highest efficacy for quitting cigarettes. That's a huge momentum and center of gravity. And what's more, you got ordinary Americans. There's now, by most estimates, 10 million plus Americans in this country alone who have switched from cigarettes to vaping. And that's an enormous nationwide, complete cross-section of Americans who understand what, advocates like AVM are arguing. So the FDA's credibility and Michael Bloomberg's own credibility in what they're arguing, erodes day by day. And, they've created a huge edifice. They've got $500 million. I get it, but they don't have mind control. They can't change. They can't force Americans what to think. And so I'm hopeful that there will be a tipping point, in the near future, in which those ideas are discredited. I mean, at the height of Prohibition, no one thought that was ever going to end either. It seemed intractable and it seemed insurmountable. And what's the old saying? It happened slowly and then all at once.